All right, welcome back. This is the last video for this week. Understanding how eating patterns and lifestyle can affect how your body works will also help you find ways to work with rather than against your body. Changing your lifestyle, your eating pattern, or stress level could help you control your eating behaviors and manage your weight more successfully. So let's move on and put this together on a personal level. If I were to ask you right now what your favorite comfort food is, how many of you could answer pretty quickly? Are you nodding your head? And if I were to ask you, when are you likely to crave that food? Do you know the answer? Feel free to share in the Facebook group what your favorite comfort food is and when you are most likely to crave that food. You'll see that you're not alone and will likely see some similarities between your answers and those of others. I want you to start thinking about what you crave, when and why. When your cravings hit, or you find yourself eating more than you intended, how strong is that urge? Many people describe it as strong, sometimes frighteningly so, and use terms like uncontrollable or out of control. For instance, people will say, I have no control over chocolate, or if I open a box of those, I eat the whole package. Some people might also refer to themselves as addicted to certain foods. So starting next week, we're going to talk about what to do when these urges hit. But for now, we're just going to focus on where our cravings are coming from and how they work. Let's do a little exercise. Sit back in your chair and make yourself comfortable. Place your feet flat on the floor, relax your arms and your hands. Now close your eyes and focus on your breathing. Feel the air coming in through your nose and filling your belly, and slowly release the air through your mouth as if you were gently blowing out the flame of a candle. Continue to breathe slowly and focus on the air entering and leaving your body. Let yourself feel like you're melting into your chair. Let all of your thoughts float up, out the top of your head, and out of the room. Just sit quietly and continue to breathe slowly and deeply, in and out. Now I'm going to name some foods and focus on your thoughts and notice the first words you think of when I say them. Pumpkin pie, broccoli, bran cereal, raw oysters, potato salad, hot fudge sundae, popcorn, shiokara, pepperoni pizza. Take one more deep breath and become more aware of the room. And when you're ready, and only when you're ready, open your eyes. How did that go for you? Did you associate any of those words with a specific situation, like having a picnic or going to a movie, celebrating a particular holiday or a season? You may have heard your thoughts say things like healthy or unhealthy, good, bad, yum, delicious, yuck, or what's that? The reason I threw in the dish shiokara, which is a real Japanese dish, by the way, look it up. The reason why I put that word in is because most of you probably don't know what that is. So you didn't have any word or feeling or thoughts associated with it yet. That exercise made you aware that you have learned to associate foods with something other than simple nourishment. We each have our own individual relationship with food that we've learned. In fact, it's only breastfed infants fed on demand that truly have a spontaneous relationship with food. Most of us have been brought up with certain routines or traditions and expectations around food. These become learned behaviors or habits. Some of this learning can be a bigger problem later in life, and that's what we'll be talking about in the upcoming sessions. So how does this happen? When one event is linked repeatedly with another, you learn to associate these two events. This type of learning was identified by a researcher named Pavlov. Does that name sound familiar? Pavlov was studying digestive enzymes in dog saliva. So obviously he had to have a couple of dogs with him in his lab, and he had to feed them. When a dog first arrived at the lab, it would be presented with food, and it would begin to salivate, and the study would continue. However, after a while, Pavlov noted that the dog's behavior changed. That is, that the dogs would begin to salivate before being fed. So his dogs began to drool when they heard the lab assistant's footsteps coming down the hall, the keys jingling, and the door opening, because they knew that food was on its way. They developed a learned response to the sound of the footsteps, which was to drool in the anticipation of food. You may have noticed this yourself if you have a dog. Let's say your dog is relaxing, and now you reach for his leash. How does your dog's behavior change? They get excited and maybe start barking or wagging their tail or going to the front door. What does your dog learn to associate with a leash? When your dog was just a puppy, it probably had no reaction to the leash because it was just another object in the house. However, after several pairings of the leash with going outside, your dog learned to associate the leash with going out. Now he responds by getting excited when you rattle the leash. We make all kinds of associations. What is the first thing you do when you get in the car? You probably automatically put on your seatbelt. Most of us reach for it automatically when we get in because we've repeatedly paired driving with wearing it. So let's take this one step further and look at our associations with food. You'll find this trigger response worksheet in your workbook. We're going to use the word trigger as the stimulus, the footsteps of the lab tech or the leash for the dog or getting in the car. The learned response is the new behavior or emotion that results from the repeated pairing. So for the dog, the trigger would be the leash rattling, which is repeatedly paired with going outside, so that makes the dog excited. Watching a movie is a trigger that makes us crave popcorn. We associate turkey with Thanksgiving dinner. When a child accomplishes something good, a goal in a soccer game or good marks, it's repeatedly paired with a treat such as candy or ice cream. So now we crave a treat when we're celebrating. When we were upset as a child, it was also often paired with some kind of treat. So now we also crave a treat for comfort. Generally, the strength of the learned response depends on a consistent or repeated pairing of the trigger and the response. The more often the pairing occurs, the stronger the relationship. So for example, let's say that you grew up having dessert after dinner every night of the week. As an adult, maybe you've developed diabetes requiring you to limit some sweets. And it'll be much harder for you to stop eating dessert than for someone else who grew up only eating dessert on Sundays or special occasions. Trying to change a learned behavior can be more difficult if you experience strong emotions around the trigger or the learned response. So, for example, if you were denied dessert if you misbehaved or you didn't eat your vegetables, this can add complexity to the learned relationship with dessert. How many of you grew up being scolded if you did not finish all the food on your plate? Many of us were reminded of the starving children in some other part of the world. If our parents grew up during the war or depression, and there was a shortage of food, then wasting food was absolutely not allowed, and it was a very emotional issue around the dinner table. As pointed out a few days ago, our portions have become much larger than many of us need, yet we don't want to leave food on our plates. We have learned that this is wasteful and unacceptable. Once you understand how this learning works, you can also figure out how to unlearn these relationships. So let's go back to the dog example. The trigger is the sight or sound of the leash being rattled, and the learned response is to get excited or expect to go outside. So if you want the dog to unlearn this behavior, the best way would be to pick up the leash many, many times without the dog going outside. This eventually breaks the association with the leash and going outside, and the dog will no longer respond with that crazy excitement when the leash gets touched. In other words, if you want a trigger to no longer lead to the learned response, you must break the link between the two. So for instance, what are some ways a child can be comforted? They could be given a hug or read a story. If they were less frequently comforted with food, the child would eventually stop associating food with being upset. Also, as an adult, if you start having a herbal sweet tea after dinner instead of a cookie or a pastry, eventually you'll stop associating dinner with dessert. Over the next little while, turn up the awareness level on all of your senses and see how many factors you notice that influence or prompt you to eat. Spend some time on the triggers worksheet and even use a couple of extra pages to write down some of your associations between activities and the emotions and food. Awareness is so key in making these changes. So starting off by just knowing what we're working with will make all the difference. Next week, we're going to focus on some strategies on how to break these associations and start taking control back of our eating habits. So feel free to post your questions or comments, or even if you're comfortable sharing some of your associations or your triggers. We're all in this together and we're here to support each other, and you may find that some people have the same triggers and associations as you do. Alrighty, that's it for today. It was a long one, so thanks for sticking it out to the end.